So let's analyze why we say market fail in the presence of externalities. Let's look at the example, a very specific example of gasoline production and consumption. Consumers obviously receive the benefits from enjoying this good, and they also pay the cost, right? You go to the gasoline station, pay the price, and you receive gas that you're going to use to probably drive to work, drive to store. Those are the benefits from gasoline consumption. Producers inquire the cost of producing the good and also receive the benefit from selling the good, right? They have to spend some money and time to actually produce the gasoline, but also whatever the price you pay, it becomes producer benefits. Since consumer costs are canceled out by producer benefit, we're going to exclude them from our analysis. So whatever you pay at the pump becomes producer's benefit or revenue, right? So those two things are going to cancel out. We're not going to include them in our analysis. So when it comes to the gasoline, you get a benefit from it. You're able to drive to work. Producers have some cost of selling or producing this gasoline. Both of those are going to be private benefits and costs. Whatever the benefit you receive, that's your private benefit. It didn't really help out the society at this moment, right? That's your private benefit. You were able to drive to work and you were able to be at your work, yada, yada, yada. Producer has some cost of selling the gasoline. They have to spend some money to refine it. They have to spend some money to transport it. They have to spend some money to sell it, right? That's once again producer's private cost. But there's also going to be some external cost associated with gasoline consumption. So we're going to say that social cost is going to account for all the costs created by gasoline consumption. So what are going to be external costs that we're also going to include in this social cost together with the private cost? Well, three different things we can talk about when it comes to the consumption of gasoline. Congestion, pollution, and accidents, all of those three things are a result of our consumption of gasoline. People driving when they consume gasoline, thus there is to create traffic. People create pollution, so somebody who's walking on the street has to breathe that air. They have nothing to do with their private consumption of somebody else. Accidents are a result of gasoline consumption. So all of those are external costs that we associate with consumption of gasoline. But if you're an owner of a gas station, are you going to include this cost into the determination of the price? Probably not. Well, the same with the owner of the gasoline station. He's not going to care about this extra cost created by the gasoline. So he's not going to include them in the price. So why is it a problem? It means that we are producing too much of the good. The price of this good is simply not high enough to account for all those other external costs associated with consumption of gasoline. Ideally, as a society, we want gasoline to be produced, absolutely. But ideally, we would like to have those costs included in the price of gasoline. If you are creating an effect on somebody else, uncompensated effect, right? We want you to pay for that uncompensated effect. If you created pollution and now somebody has to breathe that air, it would be fair to that person to receive certain kind of compensation. Of course, they're not going to directly receive it, but the part of that money could be spent on cleaning the air around us. So that's the purpose of increasing the price of this good that creates negative externality. So what can we do? How can we make sure that instead of providing the quantity of the good that private market would determine, the quantity of the good that society desires to provide? There are several policies that we can discuss when it comes to externalities. Two main approaches. First, command and control policy that will regulate the behavior directly. And that kind of policy limits the quantity of the goods or requires a particular group of people to adopt particular technology. Or we can talk about market-based policies, those policies that provide incentives. For example, we can use corrective taxes. An example of that is gasoline tax or cigarette tax, or tradable pollution permits. So let's talk about these approaches, and we're going to contrast and compare them. So when it comes to the comparison of these two approaches, usually market-based policy are better than command and control policies. The reason for it is that with market-based policies, there's no limit on improvement when you pay taxes. People tend to stop improving when they meet required minimum with regulations. So when we tax gasoline, right? If you don't want to pay that tax, if you don't want to pay that higher price, you're going to be looking for the ways to reduce your consumption of gasoline. Let's say that the gasoline tax is increased for whatever reason. Some people may think about carpooling. Some people may think about locating closer to the place of work, so they no longer have to drive as much. As a result, we created incentives for people to reduce their consumption of gasoline. We don't want to eliminate it completely, but we would like ideally to see less gasoline consumed. So there will be less traffic, there will be less accidents, and there will be less pollution. If we were adopting the regulation policy that's not creating incentives, but rather tries to regulate the behavior directly, people will stop improving when they meet certain conditions. For example, if we just say, oh, you're not allowed to drive more than 50 miles every week, right? That's going to probably create a situation similar to Mexico City example discussed in the previous chapter, right? We're not going to create incentives, but rather we're going to see more unintended consequences. We're going to see more perverse incentives. People may start getting older cars and driving them on other days when they're not, to avoid those regulations. And as a result, we may actually create worse situation than we had prior to that policy. But it doesn't say that regulations are necessarily bad. Sometimes those regulations, or we call them also command and control policies, are more effective when dealing with externalities. There exist situations in which those policies will be more better, or maybe like easier to enforce. For example, UCO tobacco-free campus policy. That's a direct policy, that's a regulation, that's a command and control policy. You're simply not allowed to smoke on campus. You're not allowed to consume any kind of tobacco on campus. Why is this policy better than an incentive policy? Well, imagine if UCO said every time you smoke a cigarette on campus, you have to pay a certain tax. Now we have to create a certain way to enforce that policy. We have to be chasing around those people who are trying to smoke around campus. We have to be recording their names. We have to be making sure that they're actually paying that money. So that would be a little bit more difficult to enforce than simple prohibition policy. You can't smoke on campus. If somebody sees you smoking on campus, they're going to ask you to leave, or they're going to ask you to stop. It doesn't mean that it's an ideal policy, but that's probably a better policy in this particular situation than corrective tax policy.